last speaker is from the RMT. Obviously, the RMT helped found the Shop Stewards Network, so we've always had a very good relationship and support from the RMT. So Jared Wood, speaking on behalf of the RMT, the London Transport Regional Organiser.
Thanks, Chair. The working class is back. That's been the message that Mick Lynch has delivered on a whole number of demonstrations in support of the strike action that's been taken across the rail industry. And I think we've just heard one of the finest examples of that we could have heard today from Garfield representing the members that he works with at Amazon. Extremely difficult, pioneering work that's going on there. They haven't got the benefits of existing structures and a history of wins and defending conditions. They've got to go in there against an extremely aggressive employer and build all of that afresh. And it's fantastic to hear the report from Amazon. I'm sure we all give our absolute full support to what's going on there. But the working class is back. More days lost to strikes last year than any year since 1989, over 4 million days lost. But it's interesting that the heights for any individual month haven't actually exceeded November 2011, when action was being taken over the public sector pensions. And I think that there's a warning in there as well, because the objective that we should set ourselves is not just to strike. That's a means to an end. It's not the end. The objective is to defend our jobs, conditions, pensions, pay now and improve them going forwards. And what that means is it's not enough to just say, we had a strike, we gave it a go. We don't want glorious defeats and a commemorative badge that we can look back on in years to come. What we need is victories, the defeat of the bosses and the maintenance of our jobs, pay and conditions. And that's going to take coordination between unions, and of course, where the action that we've taken hasn't been sufficient to record victories yet, it requires finding a way to escalate that and giving the employer a problem that they cannot get around. And that task is only going to become all the greater as we face the minimum service legislation that's going through Parliament at the present time. It's going to need itself solidarity, a higher profile public campaign to win support for the trade union position and against the legislation. And it's going to take demands on non-Labour authorities, and Kaz has already referred to this point, to refuse to implement the bill. And I'll say a little bit more about that in just a moment. We need to see a far higher profile campaign, in my view, across the trade union movement against this threat. We've been told to expect the legislation to potentially be effective from some point this autumn. And I think that one of the key demands has got to be on Labour authorities not to distribute work notices to employees. To paraphrase, we absolutely cannot accept the grotesque chaos of a Labour mayor issuing work notices to his own workers to scab on their own dispute. And frankly, any Labour authority that cannot take that position will expose the reality of the modern Labour Party to all. Of course, it won't be as simple as the Tories like to think to impose these laws. On London Underground in particular, they will face massive operational difficulties, which I think London Underground management are quietly extremely concerned about. The reality is that many tube stations now, because of job cuts that have been made, operate at the minimum legal staffing level for most of the day. How are you going to reduce that? How are you going to run that with 50% of the legal minimum staffing level? If you run half the train service, what are you going to do about the overcrowding? We're now back up to over 90% usage on London Underground from the pre-pandemic levels. In fact, it's higher than that because they hide the Elizabeth line usage figures in that figure. So if you try and run a 50% service, you're going to immediately face massive congestion problems in stations which don't even have their full staffing level because you're trying to run them with fewer staff as well. If you try and shut half the lines, then that's going to cause mayhem and overcrowding on the rest of the lines. Minimum service levels might sound great to the Tory party and go down well at the Tory party conference. For employers actually implementing them, in public services especially, that's going to be extremely difficult. And we've got to make that point, but also put the demand on them absolutely clearly that any attempt to issue work notices will be met with a massive escalation and further action by our unions against those in the course of our disputes. And, of course, the legislation itself demonstrates that the bosses know that the working class is back. The bosses recognise that we've got organised. They know that we are taking far more strike action than in the past. But they, too, are becoming far more combative against us. And we have to recognise that that's the case. I think people would have been amazed that London Underground could withstand 7 days of total shutdown in industrial action over the last 18 months. I think they would be amazed that the National Rail Network, which has been shut down on twice that many occasions by industrial action, just by RMT, with the ASLEF action on top of that. The employers are digging in. The employers are financed by the government to dig in. The companies don't lose money. The privatised train operating companies don't lose a penny when there's strike action. The government just steps in and bails them out. London Underground's short-term financing agreement, which is absolutely catastrophic for investment in public transport and workers' pay and conditions, nevertheless insulates them in the event of industrial action. And even if the bosses weaken and think actually there's a practical way of trying to move this forwards, they are vetoed by the Department of Transport and told that they must not make those offers. Because, of course, what's going on here is much bigger than just a desire to reform public transport. That exists, of course. Of course they want to try and cut the wages and cut employment in public transport. But what this is about is enforcing lower wages, job cuts and changes in conditions right across the public sector and then right across the economy of Britain. And so whatever action we take, we are involved in a constant battle, and Kaz has referred to the example of the Coventry bin workers who staged that fantastic action, won their dispute outright, and yet a year later they're back fighting again because the bosses are coming back at us once again. In reality, we're involved in a dispute at this time over who is going to pay for a historic crisis. The bosses say it's a crisis of COVID and a war in Ukraine. They say that's why we've got the problems that we've got. Absolutely it isn't. It's a crisis of capitalism. And that's not to advance any conspiracy theory about COVID. It's a real crisis. Let's make no mistake about that. But what capitalism the way that capitalism responds to that is to try and maximise the advantage for the ruling class and use it as cover to force lower pay and conditions on workers. They all had their snouts in the trough. All the Tories with their families and friends running bogus PPE companies, making a fortune out of the COVID crisis. Serco, who subcontract on London Underground, making a fortune out of COVID testing. It was a real crisis, all right, but their attitude was, what can we make out of this? They remembered Winston Churchill's words, never let a good crisis go to waste. And of course, it's the second time we've seen this in 11 years. Second time in 11 years that governments and the public sector have had to step in to bail out capitalism from an absolute catastrophe and the collapse of their economic system. 2008, they did it all by themselves through the banking system. They didn't need a biological virus. Isn't biological, is it? They didn't need a virus. They just needed to wreck the economy through the banking system. And the states stepped in around the world to bail them out. What did they do? In Britain alone, after 2008, Over 11 years, they put £900 billion in quantitative easing straight into the bank accounts of the rich, straight into all the investment funds, into the financial system. None of us saw it. None of us saw any of that. They got it, and that's why you've seen such massive increases in asset prices over the last 10 to 15 years. They can bail out the rich and powerful with endless resources, but when it's our jobs and our conditions, they want to use those crises to try and convince us that there's no alternative. We've got to accept lower wages, we've got to accept less jobs and poorer public services. That's what we're fighting against at the present time. In London Underground, which is the area that I represent as the London Transport Regional Organiser, we've been told that because of COVID, we have to cut £1 billion from the annual budget of London Underground. The bonuses are still getting paid in the City of London, but we've got to cut £1 billion. That means job cuts, it means a tax on our pensions, and now we've been offered another below-inflation pay rise for this year, and we're presented with slideshows telling us that we've gone into further deficit and we're now making an £800 million a year loss on London Underground. And then 2 days later, they're press releasing in the Standard, London Underground's now making an £80 million profit, and on this basis, we can now pay the bonuses to the senior managers that have been withheld for the last 2 years. They've appointed a new permanent commissioner. Well, it's the same guy, but they've appointed him permanently now as the commissioner of TfL, 45 grand increase to £400,000 a year. One economic presentation for that, another one when we talk about pay and job cuts for the workforce. That's the situation that we are up against. The Resolution Foundation recently produced data that showed that on average across the economy, every single worker in the economy is earning £11,000 a year less now than if growth and the share of distribution of growth had remained as it was in 2008. Just think about that for a moment. Every single person working, on average, is earning 11 grand less as a result of government policies in Britain since the 2008 crisis. So we've got a clear task in front of us as trade unionists. We've got to defend our members on those day-to-day issues first and foremost. That will always remain the case. But we also have to look up and we have to build a generalised resistance to this capitalist crisis and the attempt to make us pay for it. We need a generalised resistance that offers a political as well as an industrial alternative, because without that, we're in the position of the Coventry bin workers. We might win one day, but the next year you're back fighting the same thing again. We need to raise workers' sights. We need a different political alternative in front of people. We need a unified trade union movement behind that. I'm sure that all of you will be fighting for that within your respective unions. I hope that the RMT will continue to play a leading role in that process. Solidarity.